Okay, well, thanks everybody for joining us today for the second roundtable in the What We Don't Talk About When We Talk About Crisis series. Um, Please make sure to visit our website, tautegory.org, to sign up for our mailing list, and also to check out an exchange we organized last year on Eric Heo's Humanist Reason. It's quite relevant to this series as well. It's published on our blog. And there are a bunch of really excellent contributions and back and forth with Heo and a series of respondents. Today's event is being recorded and it's going to be posted online. So please keep yourself muted until you're called on to speak. We're going to begin by hearing from each of our presenters, and afterwards we're going to open the floor for a discussion. Priority is going to be given to participants from either the first or the second roundtable, and then from audience members who haven't contributed recently to these events and discussions. I ask that you please try not to ask a question in chat so it can make it into the recording. Obviously, if you need to leave and you want to put a question in chat, I'll keep an eye on it and I'll try to ask it, in your stead. If you want to ask a question in the question and answer period or make a comment, please use the raise hand function. I'll keep a kind of running track of who's speaking, and I'll call on you and ask you to unmute. We're scheduled to end today at 4. We have flexibility to stay on longer. These things tend to run a little bit over, so that's where we are. We'll probably do a firm cap around 4:45, 5, just for everyone's sanity and so that the recording isn't extra long. I'm going to introduce all of our presenters in speaking order before we get started, and then we'll get started with the presentations. First, we're going to hear from Jonathan Arac, who is Mellon Professor of English Emeritus at the University of Pittsburgh, where he founded and directed the Humanities Center. He remains active on the editorial collective of Boundary 2 and also with the Keywords Project, which in 2018 published a collected volume, Keywords for Today. He began college teaching in 1968 as Edward Said's TA for the Harvard Summer School course on modern British literature, and he retired in 2020. Even before Boundary 2, he was inspired by Leroy Searle to become an early member of the Society for Critical Exchange. In his talk today, he focuses on Lionel Trilling, whom he has long disagreed with. In 1987, in Critical Genealogies, Arac argues against Trilling's use of the category Stalinist. In Huckleberry Finn as Idol and Target in 97, Arac criticizes Trilling's role in the hyper-canonization of Twain's book. And in a forthcoming essay on Absalom, co-authored with Hortense Spillers, Arac finds Trilling shockingly complacent concerning the politics of civil rights. Now, you should all know that Jonathan negotiated this opening to shave some time out of his talk, so he's quite wise. So there's a setup on Trilling that's important, so we all have that. After Jonathan, we're going to hear from Paul Jaussen, who's an associate professor of literature at Lawrence Technical University in Southfield, Michigan, where he chairs the Department of Humanities, Social Sciences, and Communication. His teaching and research focus on modern and contemporary literature, literary theory, and the relationship between literature and technology. He is the author of Writing in Real Time, Emergent Poetics from Whitman to the Digital, and with Mary Balcoon and Jeffrey Gray, an editor of A Companion to American Poetry, which was published by Wiley Blackwell in 2020. His recent work includes an essay on systems theory and literary form for a special cluster on literary cybernetics, which was just published hot off the presses in New Literary History, and an article on contemporary poetry's forensic aesthetics forthcoming in the journal Criticism. His new book, tentatively entitled Contemporary Poetry and the Aesthetics of Breaking Worlds, is being revised for publication with Northwestern University Press. After Paul, we're going to hear from Anna Kornbluh, who is Professor of English, Director of Graduate Studies, and a member of the United Faculty Bargaining Team at the University of Illinois, Chicago. She is author of The Order of Forms, Realism, Formalism, and Social Space, Marxist Film Theory and Fight Club, Realizing Capital, and forthcoming from Verso in 2023, we hope they hurry up, Immediacy, or The Late Style of Too Late Capitalism. Essays on psychoanalysis, climate fiction, academic labor, and TV have appeared in venues like Theory and Event, SAQ, Mediations, Novel, the LA Review of Books, and the Chronicle of Higher Education. She is the founding facilitator for two scholarly collaboratories, the V21 Collective and Intersect, the Inter-Chicago Circle for Experimental Critical Theory. After Anna, we're going to hear from Mark Long, who is Professor Emeritus of English at Keene State College. During his 25 years at the college, he taught courses in English, American, and Environmental Studies, served as the English Department Chair, Coordinator of American Studies, Coordinator of First Year Writing, founder and co-director of the Calderwood Institute on the Teaching of Writing, and director of the campus-wide Integrative Studies program. In addition, he is the co-founder of the Environmental Literature Institute at Phillips Exeter Academy, a summer teaching workshop for secondary educators. Mark has published many essays, book chapters, and reviews. He's the co-editor of Approaches to Teaching the Works of Ralph Waldo Emerson, Teaching North American Environmental Literature, and his most recent projects include the essays Close Reading at the End of Time, highly recommend, and, sorry, now it just happened, and What Stayed With Me, Art, Conviviality, and Culture in William Carlos Williams and Gary Snyder. He's also done an excellent open access digital concordance to the poems of William Carlos Williams that he built with his son Nathaniel, and a forthcoming co-edited collection of essays entitled Approaches to Teaching the Works of William Carlos Williams. Finally, we're going to hear from Zachary Tavlin, who teaches in liberal arts and visual critical studies at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. His recently published book, Glancing Visions, Surface and Depth in 19th Century American Literature, was recently published by the University of Alabama Press, and he is currently working on 3 book projects, one on serialism and criticism, one on network film theory and Robert Altman's wonderful film, Nashville, and one, a co-edited collection of essays on Dickinson's poetry and climate change. You can find his work in Critical Inquiry, Diacritics, Philosophy and Literature, English, J19 ESQ. He is an associate editor at the Wallace Stevens Journal and also runs SAIC's Humanities Colloquium. So please join me in welcoming our first panelist, who is Jonathan Arac. Jonathan, go ahead and unmute yourself and get us started.
Thank you, James. Thank you to everybody who's here taking part. What we don't talk about when we talk about crisis, my answer as a title is The Long Lineage of Cultural Politics. In professing criticism, John Guillory faults a mistake within literary study. We transformed our field fairly recently by asserting a wrong connection between literature and politics, specifically a social justice politics arising from the 1960s. I claim to the contrary that whether a link between literature and politics is good or bad, it's existed far longer and stronger than Guillory's account would hold it. Specifically, it was already there in the 1960s when I was being educated. I illustrate my claim through the figure of Lionel Trilling, who was born in 1905, died in 1975. Trilling is nearly invisible in current understandings of literary criticism, although he rates full chapters in major recent works of American Cold War intellectual history by Samuel Moyne and Louis Menand. Trilling's work and position never became the mainline, yet his vision has flourished beyond his time, and it has sustained practitioners whose specific views differ from his, as mine do and keep doing. Trilling stands for the value and legitimacy of directing literary criticism to the culture at large, which always includes politics. I find it ridiculous to affirm it, but it needs saying. For decades, from the 1940s into the 1980s, Trilling was a massively prestigious critic. His work and career provided an aspirational model for many younger scholars, especially of American literature. It needs saying because first in the Cambridge History of American Literature, Volume 8, 1996, and then a generation later in John Guillory's Professing Criticism, he's erased. The Cambridge authors, Gerald Graff and Evan Carton, explain that they chose to focus on what they call the academization of criticism, which required, they say, giving short shrift to such brilliant cultural commentators as the scare quotes so-called New York intellectuals of the 1940s and 50s, whose largely non-academic and cross-disciplinary criticism might be central to a different kind of account. It's the end of that quote. Accordingly, Trilling gets 6 brief mentions. Yet the Cambridge history gives many pages each to such cross-disciplinary figures as Derrida, Foucault, and Adorno, none of whom held tenure in literature departments of the US Academy. In the same vein, again with scare quotes, Guillory names Trilling with Edmund Wilson and Susan Sontag as so-called public intellectuals, whose work, he says, failed to model interpretive practice for the literary professoriate. Says I, Wilson and Sontag were professional writers, neither with a PhD. Late in life, Wilson held an occasional visiting professorship. Sontag spent 5 years as an untenured faculty member around age 30 while establishing her career. Trilling, in contrast, shaped his life to become a professor. Even after his fame, he remained a faculty member at Columbia. He came to Columbia as a freshman in 1921, stayed for a PhD, and when he died in 1975, he was still there. He held a university professorship, the institution's highest academic distinction, and Harvard had twice tried to recruit him. As the first Jew to gain tenure in English at a major private university, he is widely understood to have played an important institutional role in the transformation of academic criticism. He took full part in faculty governance, spending innumerable hours on committees. No one could have been more academic. Like many other professors, only rarely did it make him happy. Yet for Guillory, Trilling doesn't count. How can this be? Unlike the Cambridge history, Guillory doesn't attach his view of the last 50 years in academic criticism to any names, whether for praise or blame. Consider Frederick Jameson, whose institutional stature might be demonstrated as greater than Trilling's or anyone else's by an objective professional measure. Jameson is the only person ever to win the MLA Prize for Best Article in PMLA, 1971, for Best Book, 1990, and for Lifetime Achievement, 2011. Guillory mentions Jameson dismissively on one single page. I quote, "The assumption that Jameson's version of theory has widely governed critical practice seems to me mistaken." On the other side, I would assert that many a career has drawn encouragement from Jameson's stated view that it is politically meaningful for Marxist critics to gain academic employment. Guillory's assumption that one single way of doing things has, to use his terms, modeled or governed our critical practice seems to me mistaken. As sociologist Michel Lamont, an actual student of Pierre Bourdieu, demonstrates in How Professors Think Inside the Curious World of Academic Judgment, 2009, recent literary study differs from other humanities and social science disciplines because even its most highly credentialed practitioners do not agree on what counts for excellence. Guillory's neglect of Trilling points to a further problem, and he candidly attempts to state the problem, though I think he doesn't quite hit the target. Guillory says in his preface that he originally planned to produce a continuous history, what he calls a linear narrative, but he found it impossible to execute. For Guillory, quoting him now, that plan ultimately proved impractical, largely because of my limitations as a scholar of English literature. Guillory does not wish he were a better scholar of English literature. Rather, he means that he's limited because he's a scholar only of English literature. He names two concrete obstacles. First, quoting, "the asymmetric relation between English and the modern foreign languages in the Anglo-American university." I sneak in parenthetically, Jameson is credentialed not in English, but modern foreign languages. Guillory continues, despite barking dogs, Guillory continues, the converging and, as the second reason, the converging and diverging histories of British and American literary study are equally difficult to integrate. He means by what he calls British literary study, criticism, as he says, practiced in the United Kingdom. Of course, he could have meant the study of English literature, his field of origin, in contrast to the study of American literature, which somehow became mine. This is how Guillory goes astray. He seems not to recognize that students and professors of American literature may not only believe, but may actually participate in a long-standing practice that Trilling most powerfully exemplified, namely, judgments made about literature and its study connect directly to the national culture and carry real political implications. It's not just fantasy. Living in the state of Florida, I disagree with Governor DeSantis's specific judgments and policies, but I agree with him that what students are required or even allowed to read in schools and universities is a live and significant political fact, as is also how they are encouraged to think about what they read. Back many years ago in doctoral study, I specialized in Victorian literature and culture. And Trilling's early book on Matthew Arnold came to the fore, pointing towards a compelling larger issue that's never left me, the historical formation of the role of the critic. So my access came through Trilling the Victorianist. Trilling and Raymond Williams's Culture and Society together fed my thinking, both strongly and pointedly diverging from 30s Marxism, Williams as a socialist, Trilling as a liberal. For Trilling to become who he did, starting as a communist fellow traveler in the early 1930s and then turning away, required not just a free, but also a fighting spirit. I have disagreed with Trilling repeatedly and vehemently across decades of my published writing, but I found in him a large lesson he took from Arnold and made part of American culture in the second half of the 20th century. As I titled a recent essay of mine that appeared in ALH last year, quoting Arnold, but also citing Trilling, "The critic's duty is to refuse." Trilling made his soul and also his career by refusing Stalinism in the 1930s and 40s. But after his hugely influential collection of essays, The Liberal Imagination, 1950, by the time of Eisenhower and the full Cold War, the time of Oppenheimer's security hearings, for those of you who've seen that this summer, there wasn't much left of that. Not a lot of Stalinists around. The refusals Trilling made later in his life, most relevant to us now this minute, I think, affirmative action, separate him from me and from many more of us. Yet I find enduring value in the fundamental premises that guided Trilling. In his notes for a 1971 autobiographical lecture, Trilling places his life's critical work as addressing what he considered something new, and which he calls, in italics, underlined, the politics of culture. He means, quoting now, a politics in which concern is not with immediate personal interest, but with the interest of others, with the moral assumptions of the polity, with the quality of life that the polity governs and sustains. These late notes were first published in 1979, the year the journal Social Text was founded to promulgate a renewed politics of culture. No thanks to Trilling in any direct way, but a continuity I would like to claim. In 1948, 75 years ago, Trilling wrote to John Crow Ransom, a letter I find crucial for controverting Guillory's historical claim. That year, Ransom founded at Kenyon College, where he taught and where he edited the Kenyon Review, a summer institute, the Kenyon School of Letters. Think of the School of Criticism and Theory that Murray Krieger launched at Irvine in 1976 and which still exists at Cornell. The Kenyon School implemented the idea Ransom had put forth in an essay of 1937, known to many of you, I'm sure, called Criticism, Inc., I-N-C, period, Criticism Incorporated. He wished. There, Ransom had urged the practice of criticism to become organized and disciplined, not just random insights and praise or blame. Ransom was a poet, teacher, and Southern Christian conservative, a founding figure of new criticism, the teacher of Cleant Brooks and Robert Penn Warren, Alan Tate, and others. Yet he chose for the two not Brooks, but Tate. Yet he chose for the two founding senior fellows of the school, critics nearly a generation his junior who were radically different from him on anybody's map, both far less formalist, both far more left. F.O. Matheson, author of American Renaissance and a Christian socialist gay man, and Lionel Trilling, New York Jew and Freudo-Marxist. Trilling and Matheson, nonetheless, were not allies, since Trilling saw Matheson as Stalinist. In my view, this trio speaks very well for all three of them. They saw there was a goal. Criticism was a good that could join them for all their differences. But Trilling would have had none of this feel-good story I'm offering. The critic's job is to refuse. Trilling is distressed, he writes to Ransom, that we critics have by now become institutionalized. He didn't mean we were dangerous and jailed. He didn't mean we were crazy and locked up. He meant just institutionalized routine. He asks Ransom, I wonder if you ever get a notion of how established the critical idea has become, Now the danger comes that all that was won with difficulty will turn into academic cliche, given back to us by almost all the students who were at all bright. 75 years before professing criticism, Trilling was already sick of it. In a 1961 letter, Trilling offers a simple summary of what remains the perspective he did most to articulate in American literary study, and which still, I believe, bindingly but non-coercively guides many of us. Quote, "In those days, we were all political, as I still feel I am, in the sense that we thought that cultural preferences were bound to lead to political choices and even to some degree of political action. And also in the simpler sense that we thought that political partisanship would express itself in cultural preferences and cultural action." Done.
Jonathan, thank you so much. Really rich stuff, and I'm quite excited to see where Paul Jaussen takes us. So Paul, go ahead and unmute yourself and go ahead.
Fantastic. Can everyone hear me? Well, I'm really grateful to be here today. Thanks to James for this invitation. In my time, I'm going to offer a few speculative hypotheses on the crisis discourse, recognizing as I do so that there are many brilliant people already addressing these problems. I gladly acknowledge that their thinking has informed what I am about to say, and also admit that the conditions under which I teach, write, and now chair a multidisciplinary department keep me from engaging this work with the depth and attention it deserves. So as a placeholder for the many citations I would like to include, I want to thank all of the speakers in our last gathering, as well as all of those who are here today, and also acknowledge Matt Siebold's timely podcast series, Criticism Limited, which brings together thinkers who have inspired and challenged me, including Kim Adams, Jed Esty, John Guillory, Jeffrey Herlihy Mera, Andy Hines, Ignacio M. Sanchez Prado, Bruce Robbins, Ryan Ruby, and certainly not least Anna Kornbluh, who I'm really glad is here with us today. So in our last gathering, Kristen made a case for stating the obvious. Here's something I think is obvious. The crisis discourse is distributed across several genres, and one central genre is the declension narrative. Declension narratives typically include a melancholic attachment to some fantasy of times past, and US literary criticism is not immune to this temptation. And my comments today are really focused on the US context. I think they would be interesting to think about it more globally as well, but I'm just focusing on the US here. So I propose calling our nostalgic fantasy object Big MLA. Big MLA is an imagined Edenic period, usually projected onto the post-World War II era before the entrenchment of neoliberalism. In the day of Big MLA, we fantasize, enrollments were high and literary scholarship was well funded. There was an overabundance of tenure-track jobs, and our endowed chairs were flush with cultural capital. The Big MLA convention of our dreams was a literary version of South by Southwest, where growing departments, mandated by their enlightened deans and provosts to build world-class English programs, would fiercely compete to recruit all of the brilliant graduate students, who themselves were mobbed by journalists seeking to scoop the next trend in literary studies. Big MLA was the good times, this fantasy asserts. And our crisis as a profession is that we don't know how to reclaim those lost halcyon days. So, hyperbole aside, I call Big MLA a fantasy object because it has some historical justification. Certain things were better for the profession in the post-World War II era, especially in the number of tenure-track positions. But this object is equally a fantasy because some of our purported losses, especially in enrollments and research funding, are not quite as dramatic as we often assume. And there are areas in which we have also significantly improved. We have made small but consequential gains in diversifying our faculty, students, and literary canon. We are publishing more and more diverse scholarship, as well as para-academic work, to borrow Ryan Ruby's phrase. And we have developed robust digital resources that make our work more accessible, such as the growing roster of literary podcasts, like the one I just mentioned, and academic YouTubers. In other words, the decline is more complex than the fantasy suggests. If that is the case, then what is the true desire we are manifesting with Big MLA? At its core, I think the loss we mourn is the institutional and cultural prestige of literary studies. Big MLA is a vibe. It's the self-assurance and pride that comes when we consider ourselves to be significant to the institutions from which we emerge as a profession. We see our cultural capital slipping away, and we are desperate to get it back. Thus, the function of the big MLA fantasy. When faced with actual losses in our material conditions, we comfort ourselves with a distorted history. I strongly suspect that our decline in institutional prestige has very little to do with our internal evolution as a profession, and far more to do with historical shifts in the strategies of US imperialism, when the early Cold War investment in culture as an anti-communist weapon gave way to the focus on neoliberal economic dominance under Ronald Reagan, which later evolved into the Obama-era culture of STEM in which we find ourselves today. These changes in the geopolitical landscape and national environment have, in my mind, significant explanatory power when it comes to the institutional fate of literary studies. And there's nothing that the rise of high theory, the culture wars, the hermeneutics of suspicion, the digital humanities, or surface reading could have done to make this world historical evolution otherwise. Fantasies can be sustaining, but they can also be destructive. Here are 3 negative consequences that arise from melancholic attachment to big MLA, in my view. And there are others. First, the desire for institutional prestige means that we contort our work to the values of those institutions. Our historical attempts to match the methods and outcomes of the sciences is a classic instance of this prestige hunting. Similarly, when we wring our hands debating questions like, what is our purpose, object, and value? What we often mean is, how do we make our value apparent to provosts, deans, and boards of trustees? In seeking out their approval, we end up internalizing their values as our own. There's a serious opportunity cost in fretting over this question. We spend far more time than necessary trying to convince such figures of our value, which may prevent us from other equally important work. And I'm going to make at this point later on, I am not arguing that we shouldn't fight for institutional resources. I'm just thinking about how much time and energy we should be spending on that fight. That's really what I'm interested in here. Second, the big MLA fantasy seduces us into making institutional prestige the goal. And we are coming to realize that this pursuit is, at best, a case of cruel optimism. Contemporary US institutions simply do not care about us. Their values are aligned with imperialism and capitalism, and only to the extent that literary studies can support those agendas will they keep us around. Or not even then. See, for instance, Sarah Blackwood's moving account of Pace University's English program that faced termination even after it significantly increased its enrollments. A third negative consequence of our attachment to the big MLA fantasy is that it prevents us from recognizing alternative histories, other models for literary study, and its relationship to institutions. And I had no idea Jonathan was going to talk about Lionel Trilling in this context, but I actually think there's some really powerful resonance between our papers on this point. History is full of creative, insurgent, fugitive, and liberatory examples of communities that advanced complex literacy. Our desire for big MLA leaves us in the condition of a teenager so desperate to date the captain of the football team that we miss all the smart, sexy people standing beside us who might make us happier anyway. Let me wrap up my comments by briefly describing one such fugitive example of critical literacy, an alternative, in my view, to big MLA. My story comes from the history of Detroit's labor activism, and it powerfully demonstrates how one might strategically occupy the university. It is also quite resonant with this week's news. Huge shout out to the workers of the UAW who today extended their strike. And I should also add that when I was a graduate student at UW, I was a UAW member because they were the union representing the graduate student workers. In 1968, John Watson was appointed the editor-in-chief of the South End, the Wayne State University student newspaper, a position he acquired through the strategic help of his comrades in the Dodge Revolutionary Union movement. Watson argued that, as a public institution, Wayne State was obliged to serve the public good, and by extension, the South End was not exclusively for the students and faculty of the university, but for the people of Michigan and especially the city of Detroit. Under his editorial leadership, the paper began covering local labor struggles, reporting on the living conditions of the poor and working class, and running stories that raised class consciousness and forged solidarity within the community. They also increased their distribution. So they didn't just distribute the paper on campus, they distributed it in the city's neighborhoods and things like that. Additionally, Watson welcomed journalism that recounted people's struggles from across the globe. One particularly controversial story addressed the Israeli occupation of Palestine. In this way, the South End was deeply embedded in the concrete material conditions of its local community, while actively drawing textual lines that located these Detroit struggles within a broader international movement. Anger over Watson's editorial choices made its way to the Michigan State Legislature, which put pressure on Wayne State's president to reclaim control of the South End. But Watson had done his homework. While he and his allies retained control of the editorial board, there was nothing that the state or president could do to stop them. And for more of this story, be sure to check out Dan Georgakis and Marvin Stern's really classic book, Detroit, I Do Mind Dying, where they have a whole chapter dedicated to the South End. So what if we took the activism of John Watson and not the prestige of John Crow Ransom as a guiding light in shaping the future of literary studies? There are at least 3 important lessons to draw from the story of the South End. First, Watson saw that achieving institutional power was a tactic, not an organizing strategy. We certainly cannot ignore the significance of institutional reputation and resources, but reclaiming the prestige of big MLA should not be our overarching purpose. Instead, we should view our institutions as sites of potential resources that we can tactically leverage in the service of promoting complex literacy in our communities. Second, Watson maintained a global network of writers and thinkers that enlivened and inspired the practice of Detroit struggle. Intellectual networks are no longer monopolized by universities. As this roundtable illustrates, it is possible to hold international literary gatherings and circulate works in ways that would have been unimaginable even 10 years ago. Third, and to me, this lesson is the most important, Watson's relationship to local struggles for liberation turned the South End into an instrument for emancipatory literacy. I use this phrase to indicate both that complex literacy is emancipatory and to remind us that every struggle for liberation has also included a struggle for reading and writing, for the people's right to the life of the mind, for new schools, new modes of teaching, for what Fred Moten and Stefano Harney call study. This history of study arising from liberatory praxis should empower us to assert the transdisciplinary project of reading, writing, and critique, not as humanistic mystifications, but as a concrete, self-evident dimension of any liberatory enterprise. I'm thinking of American slaves risking punishment in their pursuit of reading, of underground theory groups avoiding the surveillance of totalitarian regimes, of the proletarian scholars in the global South who today are turning to YouTube academics for their education. Emancipatory literacy has never needed big MLA. It can arise everywhere and anywhere. We just need to fight for it. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Provocative and excellent way to open up the session. Anna, love to hear from you next.
Okay, great. Thanks for everybody for being here, and definitely to James for the work of convening us. I agree completely that it's really important to have these conversations in our para-institutional ways, and also that I've learned so much from last week's session, which I'm sorry I couldn't attend, but I did watch. All right, so in the pages of the Wall Street Journal and the New Yorker, on legislature floors and campaign stumps, the crisis of higher education is paranoid snowflake intolerance, and the crisis of the humanities is an enthusiasm gap. One sure sign that this crisis narrative reeks of ideology is the careening contradiction in the portrait of college students as simultaneously effete decadents and ruthless calculators. College students have all the wrong values, virtue signals instead of classics literacy, me search, not Middlemarch, and college students savvily perceive all the right values, engineering and business, not history or art. Through the scrim of this ideology, the mainstream professional class, most especially journalists trained in the humanities and working at legacy publications, and politicians trained at Ivy League schools, dissemble the forbidding generational restriction of access to the professional class as if it were an attitude problem. So long literature, philosophy, language, and history, TikTokers don't drop with long books, sensitive readers of the present deride the distance of the past, and anyways, everyone is always already embarked on careers as self-manifesting influencers, a creative economy with no need for creative education. It doesn't require a PhD in ideology critique, although I can't help telling Jonathan that I was the Murray Krieger Fellow in Critical Theory at Irvine back in the day. It doesn't require that PhD to perceive beyond these attitude problem explanations of crisis to a context of comprehensive privatization and privation. Administrators and governors have mounted a serious campaign against government funding for humanities and arts research, against public higher education, and against free inquiry for all. At the same time, what few public education funds remain have very often been diverted to corporate welfare in the form of academic engineering firm partnerships, ed tech offshoring, and construction subsidies. Divestment from public education reinforces divestment from other areas of social reproduction, like healthcare and childcare and housing and transportation, offloading the costs of society onto individuals, human capital pulling itself up by its bootstraps, while mega corporations obscenely bloat with upward transfer. This 1-2 punch of defunding and pillaging belongs to a yet broader context. Divestment from public institutions, responsibilization of individuals, and raiding of public coffers for private gain are fiscal markers of what the Greek finance minister Yanis Varoufakis and the American cultural critic Matt Siebold call Ponzi austerity, the scheme to make the public, as taxpayers and as indentured individuals, foot the bill for spending sprees that benefit only private equity and banks. These benefits are capitalist life support amid secular stagnation, the decline in growth in every G7 economy for the last 50 years. Secular stagnation isn't a Marxist crank theory, as also acknowledged by all kinds of historians, economists, and even Larry Summers himself, right? They all agree that what Robert Brenner calls the long downturn is objectively indicated. On the labor side, by static wages and diminishing benefits and responsibilization and structural unemployment, and on the capital side by decreasing rate of founding of new firms and decreasing number of stock exchange transactions, by corporate stock buybacks, slow rate of computer and other technological advancement, and most importantly, the slackening rate of business investment. Stagnating production wreaks intensified circulation, the other side of capitalism's value circuit. If you can't make more, just deliver everything faster. Just-in-time logistics, gig services that cut out the middleman, high-frequency trading, the 24/7 digital working day, these are all compressions in the exchange process that don't increase production. And they're all ecocidally energy intensive. Thus, it's a certain deceleration of capitalist production that ends up corresponding to the great acceleration of fossil fuel consumption and atmospheric carbonization. Terminal crisis suborns the petromobility extravaganza that's incinerating the habitable planet. So what we don't talk about when we talk about crisis in the pages of the New Yorker or in the halls of Yale is manufactured crisis, the dispossession of the public, the wanton degradation of Ponzi austerity and secular stagnation. What we don't talk about when we talk about crisis as an attitude problem is that the dismantling of rational inquiry and defunding of speculative research and de-skilling of humanist labor are not demand side issues, they are supply side issues. What we don't talk about when we talk about crisis as the contrast between skills and silliness, engineering and frillery, is what Ruth Wilson Gilmore calls organized abandon, the dereliction of the very idea of a society and the destruction of the material of our habitable ecosphere. The myopic focus in the national media on the cultural decadence and economistic savvy of college students at elite institutions occludes the interconnection of divestment, stagnation, and ecocidal circulation. But institutions of higher education of modest repute that serve the public good in unsung states illustrate that interconnection graphically if reporters ever wanted to look there. Alaska, Kansas, North Dakota, Wyoming, West Virginia. These are state university systems that are decimated by rapid, large-scale cuts, in many cases recommended by the one boutique marauder consultancy firm, RPK. And it's no coincidence that they're the tip-top states in the nation, the very most reliant on mining and oil and gas extraction in their revenue systems. Nor is it any coincidence that federal subsidies for fossil fuels have skyrocketed during stagnation to at least $7 trillion annually across the G7, according to that Marxist source, the IMF. The for-profit ecological destruction ramped up as a result of stagnation is now rapidly curtailing the lives of those working people the stagnant economy has already devalued and expelled. The well-being of the majority, their right to curiosity and beauty, what Paul just articulated, it's simply irrelevant to a working class who a ruling class who perceives through stagnation glasses that there's too little profit and too many surplus people. When we don't talk about crisis in this materialist frame, we're left with only idealism, only the demand side fallacy that elective affinities drive university declines, only the marketplace of ideas baloney that more relatable or diverse content, more rigorous or robust methods, more auxiliary discourse will legitimate humanistic inquiry, and only the grandiose delusion that more charismatic critics will win more stars on Yelp. But we could have materialism, a conjunctural and dialectical analysis and practice that help us understand that our crisis is part of the omni-crisis. And that means not that it's too big to change, but that we have so many more comrades in arms. Humanities faculty are partners with science faculty, undermined by the same attacks on investigative disciplines and suffering the same declines in most institutions. We are partners with the debt collective movement to cancel student loans. We are partners with nurses at Rutgers University Hospital who've been on strike for months, with Starbucks baristas, with the Writers Guild of America, with George R.R. Martin and other creators suing OpenAI for theft, which is what it is, with the United Auto Workers, and with the West Virginia children who learned in 2018 from their bravely striking public school teachers to become college students who formed a union that's fighting the murder of their research university and powerfully connecting the dots on their stolen futures in extractive states. The shift away from oligarchic wealth capture and planetary arson, as many policy proponents and political theorists have shown, fundamentally involves revaluing care work, teaching above all, work that is meaningful, slow, neither for the sake of the rate of profit, nor for the sake of express delivery. This is why the fight to redress the crisis of the humanities is the fight to redress ecological destruction. Why free college was a key spine of the Green New Deal platform. Why we can look for tactics and strategies from those who are better at power struggle than we humanists with our inbuilt biases towards idealisms and persuasion. And then we can turn from crisis talk to crisis action.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Anna. Mounting excitement comes. Next up, we're going to hear from Mark Long. Mark, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Thank you, James, and thanks everyone for these wonderful talks. I'm having a little bit of internet issues, and so James, give me indication if you're not hearing me. Thanks. So the title of my talk is "Where do you teach?" What we don't talk about when we're talking about crisis are the places we work, the departments, programs, and institutions that support what we do. Well, a couple of weeks ago, Kristen, Amal, Erin, Sam, Dana all touched on these complex localized particularities. To ask the question, where do you teach, remains a provocation. It reorients attention from the general to the particular. It moves from distance to proximity. It unsettles the convenience of saying us and we. It asks us to engage in a way of thinking the poet Adrienne Rich once called the politics of location. Where Do You Teach happens to be the title of a commentary that I published nearly 20 years ago in the journal Pedagogy. And to frame my comments, I'm going to quote the first paragraph from that essay. Despite the professional opportunities in English departments outside the research university, members of the profession continue to trade the commonplace story of graduate students trained in university-based programs seeking few coveted positions, but mostly, and unfortunately, settling for jobs at second or third tier schools. In this myth, there are desirable jobs with course releases, research funding, upper-level seminars, and smart students. And there are less desirable jobs with barely tolerable teaching loads, lower-level courses, and less talented students. One reason for this persistent myth is that professionalism and specialization provide the norm for intellectual work. Preoccupied with research, members of the profession perpetuate the idea that the real work of the discipline takes place outside the classroom. With the values and practices of the research university accepted as a profession-wide standard, we devote fewer of our intellectual energies to teaching, as well as to the ever more important engagements with public audiences who benefit from our work. We diminish the commitments of faculty whose intellectual work is organized around teaching undergraduate students and whose reading and writing often arises from that work. And finally, we disadvantage new PhDs struggling to imagine rewarding careers in English programs located outside the R1 institution. My preoccupation with this problem of alignment between the intellectual cultures and priorities of particular institutions and the breadth and depth of the post-secondary system of education unfolded in two areas of my work. First, hiring new faculty at my college, and second, coordinating a graduate student and faculty mentoring program for a rapidly growing scholarly organization. My preoccupation also led to a special issue of pedagogy dedicated to small college departments. In my introduction, which I titled Centers and Peripheries, I called on our readers to better acknowledge and value difference, especially in terms of institutional mission and size. I wrote to establish multiple centers and consequentially margins from which to speak about language, literature, and the humanities. More recently, in a review of Guillory's professing criticism in the Los Angeles Review of Books, titled Where the Humanities Are Not in Crisis, Jeffrey Herrle-Mara, who teaches in the humanities program at the University of Puerto Rico, Mayagüez, considers the conversation about Guillory's book and shares his concerns with what he calls limiting views on the crisis in literature and criticism to faculty at elite institutions. He writes, it homogenizes and regulates knowledge. It makes certain solutions and viewpoints appear unviable. It's worth listening to his description of where he works, which I'm going to read from now. My institution, the Universidad de Puerto Rico, has endured a 40% budget cut since Hurricane Maria. We haven't had Project Muse for years and recently lost access to JSTOR. Articles behind paywalls require effort to read, and this immediate reality frames how literature, critique, crisis, and affiliation intersect with and inform my scholarship. I wonder, he goes on, if you have institutional research support and all the professional resources and opportunities available to Guillory and those in his cohort, what do you think about? How does that context shape your questions and uncertainties? How does it inform your understanding and experience of literature, criticism, even crisis itself? I also wonder, Jeffrey concludes, what if these periodicals and this quarrel were democratized? What do voices from other types of institution add to this debate? What do voices from universities that are truly in crisis have to say about this crisis? Does their absence from the conversation matter? And this is the last part of his article that I'll read, his review. It's not merely a curiosity, but an ethical dilemma when people experiencing a crisis cannot participate in its definition. While the downturn is different at each institution, the authority to be a mouthpiece for the crisis in the humanities from an office at a prestigious university is among the more peculiar ironies of academic hierarchy. A critique of Guillory's critique in a nutshell is that views grounded in ideologies of universality and neutrality mask their participation in the upholding of exclusive, elitist, and colonialist ways of being, reading, and interpreting. So Jeffrey, who I happen to know actually because I'm organizing a conference with him, he concludes that Guillory's conversation is a symptom of a larger problem, the problem of people in crisis unable to enunciate their own circumstances. It suggests as well, and this in spite of the self-reflexivity of our profession, Aaron mentioned in our conversation a couple of weeks ago, the challenge of self-definition. So where do I teach? For the past 25 years at a public liberal arts college and a university system in New Hampshire, a multi-branch university that includes my public liberal arts college, whose mission is centered around providing greater access to higher education. Nearly 40% of the students I have had the privilege to teach since 1998, are the first in their families to attend a 4-year post-secondary institution. Most of the students we teach are non-majors. Many, if not most of them, work full-time. And I would argue that these are students for whom the humanities really, really matter. Since 2015, Keene State has undergone catastrophic change. The shit show, to use Kristen's term at a peer Coplac school, public liberal arts college in Maine, is unfolding across the university system of New Hampshire. 10 years ago, the undergraduate enrollment at Keene State College floated around 5,000 students. Today, we have about 3,000, little under 2,900. The resulting budget shortfall in a tuition-funded school resulted in 2 rounds of staffing cut that eliminated over 50 tenure-track positions, as well as termination of small and popular programs, American Studies, Women and Gender Studies, and a few others. More recently, an administrative reorganization eliminated the dean and the School of Arts and Humanities. And most recently, a colleague holding an endowed chair in our Holocaust and Genocide program had her position eliminated as the college continues its restructuring process. So as Jeffrey asks, how does your context inform your understanding and experience of literature, criticism, and crisis? For instance, how might a once diverse and vibrant English department, where I spent most of my career with 14 tenure-track positions, respond to the crisis as retirements and a multi-phase process of retrenchment has reduced the department to 6? I want to conclude my thoughts today with 3 dimensions of an institutional context where the questions and uncertainties of what we are calling crisis might look different than what a perceptive commentator such as Guillory might assume. First, what Guillory himself calls the breadth and depth of the post-secondary education in the United States will have quite divergent responses to the relationship between expert cultures and lay readers, to use Guillory's dichotomy. At less selective, small regional schools, we are working with students who have vastly different social backgrounds, as well as radically divergent preparation skills and motivations. The professional challenges new faculty face in transitioning to communities of teaching and learning such as my own, as Guillory knows well, are daunting and raise uncomfortable questions about graduate school, professional aspirations, and intellectual work. In fact, here's Guillory framing the challenge in his 2000 essay, How Scholars Read. So now I'm reading from Guillory's essay. Perhaps the greater harm in the proliferation of unread or casually read scholarship is the devaluation of teaching both as the means for transmission of long-standing knowledge and the first venue for disseminating new knowledge? Would it perhaps be healthier in some ways if we scholars taught more and wrote less? When I have tendered this immodest proposal to colleagues, I have been greeted with the stunned silence reserved for the most intolerable social impropriety. And I was actually at the ADE session when he presented this talk. Second, I was struck by Guillory's account of the scene of evaluation, as he calls it, and the thorny professional process of determining scholarly contribution. It is odd to read an account of scholarship in this chapter as someone for over 20 years was actively involved in the tenure and promotion process at the department, division, and college-wide level. Specifically, the equation of scholarship with the fact of publication and the need, as Guillory argues, for the descriptive richness evaluation needs to cultivate. Those are his words. It is odd precisely because we have been successfully cultivating this kind of evaluative process in the tenure and promotion at my college for decades. Third, I want to close with a brief comment on Guillory's welcome discussion of the importance of teaching what he calls the art of writing. Guillory usefully isolates the problem of the pre-disciplinary first-year writing course and the need, as he puts it, to put the composition course on the table, so to speak, in curricular discussions within and beyond English and the humanities. And now here's Guillory. Let us imagine then that an imaginary and hopeful project of teaching the art of writing. As my students will often say, wait, what? Or as I will ask, who is the us of which we speak? Some of us, as it happens, were fortunate to work in both literary studies and writing studies in graduate school. And there are people like me whose scholarship and institutional work therefore moved past an imaginary scene and engaged in the practical and imaginative work of building an intellectual culture of writing. In my case, founding and directing a writing institute for faculty on the art of teaching writing across all the disciplines at the college and at all levels of the curriculum. And now, 15 years ago, during one of my terms as chair of English, designing and implementing a thinking and writing program taught by faculty across the disciplines that eliminated the English department's first-year composition course. So, when we're talking about crisis, I would urge us to listen to and learn from one another and to include in our conversations the places we work, the working and teaching conditions, the institutional values, as well as the actual experiences of colleagues in the different departments, programs, and institutions that support the work that we do.
Mark, thanks so much. Just wonderful. Finally, to close us out, and then we'll have some time for conversation and discussion. Zach, go ahead.
All right. Thanks, James, and everyone here. Somewhere between the time the sun set on New Historicism's Arcadia and the waning pitch frequency of the reading wars, the historical version of a passing siren, anecdotes gave way to litanies as the proper form of what Stephen Greenblatt used to call the touch of the real. Seas are acidifying, Gordon Gee is replacing language faculty with Duolingo, Donald Trump's poll numbers improve in the wake of his mugshot. If you don't go on, the catalog urges, how will we know you're not hopelessly naive about the power of novels to connect unhappy people across great social divides? Crisis, I hypothesize, takes the form of the list in higher ed. Lists tell us that there's always more. They end with et ceteras. They can always go to 11 if you rock it hard enough. I'm not against lists. How many have I made over the past 3-odd decades? Best left-handed pitchers of all time, top 50 post-punk bands, coolest failed revolutions in European history. In the long history of writing, stories and lists are the greatest of rivals. The earliest written lists were administrative, didactic, or mnemonic, functions that still top the list of everyday list forms. Sometimes lists and narratives get into cahoots. Without them, There'd be no scriptural literature or epic poetry, no legions of ships or devils or begattings. Lists have processing power. As a flexible and plastic medial form, they collect data without necessitating alpha to omega reading dependence, the pressures of beginnings, middles, and ends. Accounts, ledgers, logs, registers, catalogs, indexes, tables, all tally without impressing front-to-back linear narrative. Their database principle turns temporal abstraction into spatial abstraction, a competition and complementation in literary archiving and readerly transmission. I've started to wonder about the relationship between lists and stories in the discourse on crisis in higher education. And not only in the discourse. There's a clash of forms taking place on the ground. As teachers and scholars in the humanities, we're usually pretty good at telling stories. Austerity deans and provosts are even better at making lists. It's their stories that don't often make very much sense. A committee in my institution, which is an expensive selective art school, sorry, not a liberal art school, an art school, recently reimagined time. I won't delve too deeply into this, and 2 weeks ago, Kristen talked quite beautifully about this sort of thing at the institutional level. But at SAIC, reimagining time is a shock doctrine. Essentially, my students get 15 minutes less discussion of romantic poetry every week for the same tuition price. But they also have the privilege of taking one fewer liberal arts course over their time at the school. So they pay a bit less overall after you adjust for inflation, though they're still paying more as a rate, credit hour rate. Our daily schedules have shifted relative to our time zone clock. The poles of the academic day have drifted further apart. The time that's being reimagined, as you surely guessed, is not durative or qualitative, or frankly, even productive by any labor theory I understand, but tradable without tariff, which is nothing new. It's the kind of mail slotting that fits our work into the worst kinds of lists ever invented. We may be better able to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism, as the saying goes. Some of our overlords can more easily imagine the end of the humanities than the end of the faculty activity report. But another problem is that many of us are in the same boat. If academic life is damaged life, then maybe the answer is just to live in the wound, to prattle endlessly about each paper cut inflicted on our present by the powerful and ignorant. To live in the wound, that's actually a direct quote from a candidate for a vice president level position at my school. That was his advice. That would be the path to institutional reckoning. I think he meant that the institution itself is the wound, which, fine, I don't agree with that, but I get it. I think that's a thing many people do think. But wounds are tears on bodies. And if the body means anything to that metaphor, it's the actual and potential students and scholars and staff. And I often hear the phrase, wounds heal best when they're left open, which isn't even correct as medical advice. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying it's best to forget our institutional histories, the worst crimes, and the mistakes that seem to circumscribe our horizons as teachers, scholars, and workers, and by extension, our students' conditions for learning and getting smarter. Really, the exact opposite. I think we need to tell compelling stories, honest but contestable narratives, and histories that move and change rather than home in on origins, original sins, and catalogs of devils building pandemonium, which, by the way, would make a great name for the University of Alabama's football stadium. We do need to make the case, or the cases, for why we do and should be able to do what we want to do, but without painting ourselves as either saviors or satans. I think we should also accept that despite all the stacked odds against us and our students to continue to do good work, unassimilable by institutional corporatization and privatization, that we as academic intellectuals have failed and honestly continue to fail intellectually and not just politically at recognizing and articulating the importance of our particular institutions. Not nostalgically, and not in the blinkered belief that things ever worked for everyone or were designed primarily for everyone, though there's a real scale of elitisms and inequalities in higher education that should keep us from reducing all to the worst all of the time. No, I really mean thinking of our institutions as part of our infrastructural future, and not just passing time until we pass the baton to theoretical splinter cells and nomadic peddlers of guerrilla reading methods. I think we're too often ambivalent about the destruction of tenure, of academic freedom, of departments and programs, as if our exploitation and the immiseration of part-time, but not really part-time academic workers forever marks the horizon of higher education. Acknowledging that schools are not insulated from financial markets, say, should be the engine of our defenses, not the burn-it-all fait accompli it's sometimes used as. But despite the waves upon waves of shit dumped on us by developers' logics and bad investments and austerity justifications, we do inherit structures actually designed to give us time to do good work. They're not totally gone, and so they don't have to be built back from nothing. The scandal is that they're being slowly but surely taken away, especially at a moment when there's such a cultural emphasis on diversity, equity, and inclusion, including in hiring and admissions. And I take the right-wing rollbacks of all that to be evidence of this as much as a sign of its peril, which is a truly horrible irony. But still, I'm not sure crisis and its cognates are serving us well right now. Crisis, catastrophes, calamities, we should probably save more of our oxygen and also speak up, as naive as it might sound to some cynics, for some obvious things about the college, the university, and in my case, the art school, and the humanities' role in them that maybe don't need to be called to trial, as if everyone at the scene of the crime needs to be interrogated and surveilled and never cleared. Recently, 2 members of my department drafted a document trying to articulate specific principles grounding academic freedom at our school, and not just bloviating defenses of costless inquiry and the marketplace of ideas, a phrase that I think Anna already made fun of, but that also makes my skin crawl as much as faculty activity report, but articulating the concrete demands on all of us that arise from a collective commitment to reading and thinking and making at the institutional level. What derailed it was not some mini DeSantis, but actually a scientist at my school for whom all this talk about academic freedom and intellectual culture could only be unmasked as nostalgia for the good old days, for a wild art school Woodstock, which simply can't appear to our students now as anything but an embalmed corpse. We're offering our students how to walk, they said, when they don't even have any shoes. I think even the idea of teachers doing good by giving people shoes is a terrible metaphor. And it's not only anti-intellectual, but it's the kind of instrumentalism, the bad kind, that can only imagine function in terms already dictated by the very forces that we think we're resisting. And we should know that liberal arts institutions are not the only social infrastructures worth building and preserving. That seems obvious, but sometimes people think that everyone else in the room is stupid. And still, I think that willful obtuseness can be telling. What's clear is we don't have anything close to a common sense of our role as faculty and as intellectuals at whatever institutions we work. That's my sense, at least. And that's a role that's always going to be a network of commitments. It's going to be coordinated, but never single-minded. Has anyone ever actually tried to live in a wound? It's going to smell pretty bad. So if we must do that, we should have as a basic objective something more compelling than lapping up the pus. There are already a lot of people out there who dismantle the humanities, if they could, in the time between their postprandial cigar and their nightly game of pinochle. What bothers me is when anti-establishment types offer to bring the matches. If you thought I was going there, I'm not going to end by claiming that the best story always wins, that those of us who study literature can tell the best stories, the most galvanizing ones about ourselves, about our schools or our students, about how we all got to where we are and where we should go next. But I will say something about narratives themselves. One of the things that seems to motivate humanities crisis lit is the eerie feeling that we occupy a confused present tense, the twilight zone, where contraction and austerity and the supposed decline of our field's relevance snuggle under the covers with a doubled down rhetoric of boundless potential, flexibility, usefulness, and enlightened interdisciplinarity. The dominance of technocratic language spreading through our institutions like squid ink produces a shape-shifting blind spot in their auto-narratives. Narratives are what link history to value, losses to gains, the ones that don't show up in our ledgers. They also posit a distinct mode of truth, of time-bound conceptuality, of ideas inseparable from their coming to be experienced, and therefore possibly known? What is the bearing of literature, art, and criticism on life? The prospect, I think, that things of general and sometimes, in some cases, even universal significance can be embodied and presented as concrete and contingent and particular, and so therefore both thought and felt. And we need to hold that possibility forever open as teachers and scholars and colleagues, no matter how much damage we inherit. Thank you.
Wonderful.